Okay, how to build the LE press. Now, we're going to start with the easy version. This is the plans that require no tools, and you can just walk into a Home Depot, buy these parts, walk out, and start recycling for, I believe, less than $20, maybe even $15. I am not sponsored by Home Depot. That is just where I get my parts and where all of this is available. I have less than 100 subscribers. So yeah, not sponsored. But anyway, I am going to give you the part numbers so that this is really easy. So these plates, it says here 33517. It's basically some sort of wall backing plate. It's like in the plumbing section. I'm not really sure what it's for. Somebody told me it was something about reinforcing the wall, but it's a fantastic plate because it's strong, I guess, spring steel, exactly what we need, and it's got holes already pre-drilled. Now the problem with it is that this, at least at a Home Depot, is the longest bolt that you're going to be able to find that will fit. And it just barely fits. Typically you want this machine to be loose. I'll get into that in a second. But yeah, like these holes are very small. These were the longest bolts I can find. They are part number 494070, machine screws. Number 10 and 24, 3 inches long. Another problem is they're Phillips. My other presses tend to use hex, so that is a little inconvenient. But with these new clips, we'll should be able to deal with that. All right, the springs that you're going to want compression springs. You'll find this in the aisle with hinges, I think. Yeah, like hinges and door pulls, like for cabinets and stuff. Anyway, I'm sure you can look it up. 685436. You're gonna need like 2 of them, and you want these long springs, but you can also use the shorter ones as well. And I'll show you that in a second. The springs are going to be the most important thing. I believe these packages are about $4 or $5 each. Could be more than that. So this is like the most expensive part, at least, especially of this build. And it usually is a pretty pricey part of any build. And a lot of the style that you use, like you're probably going to notice that a lot of my presses are different. And it all depends on the springs that you're using. So, we'll get to that. You're going to want these really big washers. Sorry, I don't know what they are. But you basically want washers that fit your machine that you can grab a hold of. These are so when you put in the spring on, you can just compress it by hand. So you just want the hole to be small enough to where the spring doesn't go through, but big enough to where you can manhandle it. It just makes your life easier. You only need 4 of these for each device. And this is not necessary, but I would also recommend a whole bunch of washers as well. You want these to be smaller because these are used as spacers between each of the plates. So you can stack up a whole bunch of them, and this is how you can dial an exact thickness if you want. You can also use it to use these other smaller springs. I'll show that in a second. You can use wing nuts. I've been using wing nuts for a long time. They work, especially, like regular nuts are kind of fiddly. You can make these sort of, like you can make nut knobs by placing nuts into bigger nuts, and like you put them in with a vise. But anyway, I always found that wing nuts were best for tightening down. They worked really well. You do kind of need that leverage. It also makes it easier when you use a drill to kind of auto tighten the machine for you. But I've really stopped using these. I think these clips are better. So you're going to want to get some of these clips. I believe you can get these at the dollar store. I have not been able to find them, even at hardware stores for some reason, even though there are spaces on the shelf. Every hardware store nearby me was completely out. I had to order a whole bunch online. That must be a supply thing with everything going on. But you are going to want to rip off this rubber. You don't want it because this is going in the oven. Really easy to rip off. I'm not going to do all that, but you're going to want them to be bare metal. And lastly, you're going to take those really big barbecue sheets and cut them down into sheets that actually fit the plates that you're using. The holes aren't really necessary. Honestly, I made them too small even. I would hole punch bigger holes because you want it to be kind of loose. This is actually one of the more annoying parts for getting stuck when you're trying to put it on is the cloth, oddly enough. So I made these too precise. Don't worry about that. You can honestly just kind of cut the corners at an angle and just not even line it up if you want. It is not important for this to be specifically lined up. But, alright, let's throw one together. Now, I don't know if I said, but... oh, and you're going to want to remove the labels, but this is just a demonstration. You do not need 2 of these plates. Now, they're only like $1 or something. They're not expensive. I remember them being really cheap. So, it's not like really a big hurdle. When you're building the bigger machine, each plate is $10 each, so it does matter. But I'm learning more and more that less is more with this machine. You really only need 2 plates. You can use 2, but you really only need 2 if you need stronger springs. If you're just using these springs, you really don't need it. But you can upgrade this to the other machines. We'll talk about that in a bit. But yeah, so we're going to throw down some of our nonstick cloth. See, it's fidgety. Honestly, if you just cut the corners off, it's not even necessary. And this is so even when you throw in your mold. Where's my mold? I had one here. Don't know where it went. All right, let me grab a different one. Okay, you know what? We'll just make a flat piece of plastic. Well, you would place your mold here. And then you place a piece of plastic that you're flattening. You want to keep in mind like how much plastic it is going to take. It's going to be a learning curve. A lot of this is kind of feeling it out. There's no specific like amounts, but start small, go easy. Don't be like me. Don't load it up with as much as you can get and then cram it out so it flows into the gears and you got to break it apart with pliers and stuff. Go easy, go simple, and it spreads pretty far, but make yourself some flat sheets first. You can use those washers as spacers to get a nice even thickness. I would probably add a whole lot more, but I'm just going to skip for time. You're just going to add like 1. But you can imagine you can use really wide washers or just a whole bunch. And then we will add another sheet. And then another plate. All right. And we're going to use these longer springs. Now, I don't know if you'll notice, this is actually longer than the bolt. So it is a little bit annoying if you're going to be using longer springs. But they give you a lot of travel. So if you're melting a piece of plastic that's rather high, which you probably shouldn't do, on the easy version. If you're doing the light version of this, you probably shouldn't use a lot of plastic. But If you do, or if what you're melting is really tall, or your mold is really tall, you're going to find that these springs stick off the edge of the bolt. That's okay. You don't need to lower these down all the way at once. You can just get enough to get going. Oh yeah, this is why I don't use wood nuts. But I didn't clamp that all the way down. See, I can lower it more. That's not necessary. Because if I tighten this too much, it's going to be really even more difficult to get these other ones. So I just kind of want to get it on first. And these big ones, it's great. You can just kind of tilt it to the side. You don't need to worry about beating up these threads, especially if you have these. If that's how you're going to be interacting with it, you never need to put any nuts or bolts on it. It's not really necessary. So you can tear up the threads. It's fine. I'll bet you could probably even put a drill on this and tighten this down without taking the clamp off, but it's not necessary. You know, these springs are hand operatable. So you bought this, and maybe you've got like some of these extra smaller springs. If you're doing less plastic, or maybe you have like a lot of plastic and you're just like melting it a little bit or whatever, these are usable. I think these are a little weaker, but I think they're fine. I don't know if they'll hold up to the temperature over time. Where do those washers go? But you can do this. You can add a spring, throw on a washer, and then use another spring. So I guess for every 4 of these packages, if you're only using the long springs, you get like another couple of these. You get what I'm saying. You know, you can use the little ones as well if you just throw a washer in between. I don't really though. These do come in handy sometimes, depending on what you're doing. They don't have a lot of travel on them, but if you don't need that, then they work. Anyway, springs. Like I said, they're the hardest part to figure out, so hang on to all of them. Don't really have a use for the smallest ones in the box, unfortunately. They're not super useful, but what you gonna do? But yeah, that's basically it. We'll move on to one of the other ones in a second. So the first thing I do is I get all of the clamps in place. And once they're all in place, then if I want to tighten more, then I'll tighten. And you'll probably know when you're pushing it too far. Honestly, this may not even be necessary since these springs are longer than the bolt itself. Leaving it at the top is probably more than good. But if you're like me and you don't have any restraint, you can tighten them all the way down. But the process is the same for all the machines, big and small. Oh, you're also going to notice that the steel will bend as well. That's fine. That's okay. If you don't give the plastic a whole lot of room to move, or if you remove it before it gets too molten, you can get bowed plastic sometimes. But that's not usually super a concern. You could even, in theory, just use the springiness of the plates in order to melt your plastic flat, but springs are better. There's a lot of ways to use this machine, but this is simple, basic design for a beginner to get started, 15 bucks. This is it. This is all you need. You throw a mold in there, throw in some, oh, there's one. Found it. You throw in one of these Sculpey molds. These are for polymer clay. Again, not sponsored. But that would be awesome because they make really good molds. And they fit perfectly in the device. And you can start making jewelry and all kinds of really great crafts out of recycled plastic. It's fantastic. What if you want to build one of the bigger presses? well, just toss this to the side. You're going to take the same plates, but you're going to need to drill these holes bigger. You're going to need bigger bolts. And that's because we're using bigger springs. So let me pull out a container of the bigger springs. Where did they go? Well, I have them here. Shoot. I need... There we are. So I only have one of these. This is part 684838. Big old honkin' springs. Do I have ones already out of the box? I do not. Now, my original version, I don't know if you saw in that first video, I had like a sentimental version where I was using like way too many, I was using conduit plates, I was using a whole bunch of them. That's because I was using these springs. These are incredibly tough springs. This is when I really needed the wing nuts in order to, and the giant washers and everything, in order to tighten down these really, really strong springs, because that's what I originally bought this package for. Turns out I ended up using these springs instead. Now, if you're building the giant version, you're going to be using these springs. But for smaller versions, this is inconvenient that you have to kind of like modify these, and it is a little bit of a pain. But you can cut these big ones in half in order to make 2 of these smaller springs. I would also bend the end down a little bit with pliers in order to make it, a little bit more like a closed spring, a little bit easier to use. I don't really recommend that because these longer springs work well with the bigger press as well. Or the sturdier press, I guess you could say. It's the same thing. It's just you can't use these bigger, longer bolts unless you drill out the holes. So it's the exact same as the easy. You just need to drill out these holes. So if you drill these holes bigger, then you can use longer bolts, and then you can use those big, longer springs. These are just conduit. Conduit piping. Again, like super cheap, easy to cut. And this keeps me from compressing the spring all the way. Because there's 2 things you shouldn't do to a spring. Keep it compressed all the time for long periods of time, and expose it to heat. And you certainly shouldn't do both of those at the same time. We do both of those at the same time. That's how this machine operates, which is why we kind of need some rather significant springs. But yeah, if you drill, like I said, these are, you may notice these are not the same plates. These are trash plates, but it would be the same. You would be using one of these plates with the holes drilled out bigger. Same difference. Shoot, I don't know what type of bolts these are. I'm probably gonna have to find that and like list it down below with the part list and everything else. But other than that, it's exactly the same. And this one, if you do cut these in half in order to make shorter springs, it goes further because you get 2 out of 1, so you only need to buy 1 package. This package, the big springs, costs $8, $9, $10 sometimes. So if you can cut it in half, you can make a whole press out of just 1. But you're gonna need like either really significant like cutters, because this is strong. You probably need like a Dremel to slice it, which is what I did, or you'll need like some bolt cutters or something. But if you're a crafts person or somebody who has a lot of tools, you're not gonna have any problem with any of this, like at all. But you will absolutely need these bigger ones, not just for the grip, but because the spring is bigger. So the spring needs more to push against, and it can hang off the edge of the device. So you're gonna need like at least 2 of them. But other than that, you know, whatever spring considerations you need, that's all that matters. And actually from that, we can go right into the LE Press XL. So this is, I'm not going to get it with this camera angle, but you get the idea. So this is a big 12-inch by 12-inch, like it's a foot by foot plate. I believe it is the 16 gauge or 22 gauge spring steel. Just get the thicker one. It's like weldable spring steel. But this one, you will have to drill some pretty big significant holes. And then use these really long bolts. Again, I'll have to figure out what parts and stuff. I have all of that, I just don't know it off the top of my head. But other than that, principle is exactly the same. Again, put holes in your plates. You really only need 2. But sometimes you need 4. It depends. Or maybe, I don't know. Depends on what you're doing. I use 4 because I'm Mr. Overkill. But more often than not, you probably just need 1 plate. I don't know. I've been doing this for years, and I'm still learning. I'm stubborn. But yeah, you see, it's basically the same. Only you don't cut these springs. You're going to use the full. You're going to use the full spring. And yeah, get as big as bolts as you can. That's pretty much it. So yeah, those are the basics of how to construct the LE press. Good luck. Let me know if you have any questions, and recycling is a lie.